All right, so what I wanted to do was kind of get back to what I had been talking about yesterday. I got cut off a little bit, so I wanted to show a little bit more in terms of some of the things that they were doing on Dune. A lot of which really started from Dune, the original Dune. So there's Dune, Dune Two, obviously, and they won the visual effects for both those. And so the one thing that they
Thanks,
did
Ian.
a lot of really cool stuff with was the Ornithopter, and and so I'm gonna just share that screen here real quick. And so I'm gonna let them talk.
It was tricky because nothing of this size existed. So when we were looking at it originally at the start, we looked at every kind of helicopter around and ship, but the biggest attack helicopter we found was a Black Hawk, but that it would fit inside an ornithopter. It was so big. So we started going, okay, let's look at the size and weight of this. And I knew from previous films that this is an important issue for Denis to make sure this has quality and weight. So we started mucking around with Tristan and like throwing him on some shots of Black Hawks, that we comped in together just to see the scale. And we saw it's massive, it's huge, and the wingspan alone is the size of a small, like medium to small aircraft. So at the start, it was all about, okay, let's how do we resolve the size of it? Then we moved in of like, how do we actually get that size in the air?
This is one of the things that I think is actually really cool. So, they're really comparing, the size. So this is like a little Hughes 500 helicopter versus this thing that is substantially larger than it. And, they really wanted to try and make it, obviously, so it worked, in the space, and it was substantially larger. I think one of the things that you're going to really like is when they start talking about how they did the rendering for the blades, because it is
Moved in of like
it
how
was
do we
really really challenging because
How
I'll
you
show you.
did
I'll show you. Check this out. So
achieve that motion blur on the ornithopter wings, which is so beautiful. Does someone want to jump in and talk about that, the technique you used there?
before they start talking about it, I will just tell you that motion blur, when it comes to propellers, when it comes to helicopter blades, things of that nature, right, is ridiculously difficult. It has been for a long time. There are a lot of different ways you can cheat it, but from at least what they're saying in this, they didn't, and that's it's pretty crazy. Just check this out.
well, I mean, it's hard. It's a lot of rendering.
I'd
It
say
was
painfully, yeah.
yeah, painfully. It's real. It's there's maybe 11 sub steps per frame, which are rendered out. There's a bit of comp work actually just to tweak a little bit. There's a lot of shader work, getting those beautiful pings of highlights, which look amazing in the shots. But they are real. They are blades that go up and down that fast. They have a little bit of a figure eight, much like you get in a bird wing. But they're absolutely rendered. So when we had shots of multiple ornithopters, the rendering team was go, okay, let's just see how we get on with this one. But it was real, and it had to. I mean,
Especially when there's a change.
yeah,
Yeah, so that's the thing is that that's one of the things that we talk about in this class a lot is that what we're doing is basically it's just math. You're asking your computers, you're asking your render stack to just do calculations of ones and zeros, and so when you're throwing that much at it and things that are the wings are flapping like hummingbird fast. And so there's just so much for the processors to handle. And when you run into, this is one of the things that you run into. Like, yes, it looks perfect and beautiful, but every once in a while you get a frame that drops. So like you can have the whole thing working, and then there's that one frame that for whatever reason will not render properly, and that's kind of the stuff that that's what makes this stuff so difficult. And getting it on screen is such a challenge that way. So, that's pretty impressive.
As marvelous as 2D is and comp is, it's really hard to cheat that in space, especially rotating a whole ship around and changing the angle. It's some hard tricks to get that right. So it was done for real. Yeah, it was really
Right.
good.
And that was the thing. And the final point he was making is just, for as much as for myself as a comper that I would like to say, yeah, we'll fix that. You can't always, and sometimes it's just got to be done. Now there are certainly tricks that you can use with already pre-blurred images and things like that to try and make things working. But what he's really getting at is the fact that the thing rotates so much, on all these different axes. The cheats don't always work, and so figuring out a workflow that's actually going to do this is that was pretty groundbreaking, honestly, because that's not an easy thing to do, honestly. So, all right, so I think one of the biggest
Through the
ones
sand.
that that they developed obviously for this movie is the sandworms, and it's really interesting to hear how they did the process. And when we're done talking about that, I'm going to talk a little bit about how they filmed it, which is actually fascinating, specifically. So check this out.
And I think there's something here we want to talk about in terms of the sandworm itself, and the way it also interacts with the sand. Robin, again, with sort of quickly looking at reference here, what were those main things you looked at for the sandworms?
Yeah, much with the Ornithopters, I would just dive into the absolute details of it. I went really, quite biological, and really into, how could this function and move through the sand. But the interesting journey was where we went biological. I went to biological, how they move and concertina through, look at snake muscles and how they push and pull themselves through. It was good, and it was, right. It just didn't kind of click with what the sandworm is and where
Through.
So, the development process on stuff like this it's really really a challenge, obviously, because you just never quite know exactly what the director is going to sign off on, and Denis Villeneuve is he's really meticulous about his stuff, and so anyway, there's just a lot to learn here.
Denis saying, yeah, it's good, but it's not quite there yet. We had to look at it, and it was actually going through the effects and seeing effects, and how we had to just do some simulations for effects and get those working, how it kind of clicked. So taking a further step back with the anim scene, we were like, okay, well, what is the sandworm? Where does it exist? And quite quickly you saw these giant seas of sand. And
another thing that I want to point out that you guys that's incredibly difficult about doing something like this is it's one thing to animate this huge thing, which later on they start talking about. It's like it was almost like looking at it as a sand whale, right? It's like that big and it's moving so many things. But the other part of it is you can't just like throw it on the screen and say, okay, hey, look, it's animating, it's undulating in the way that you want it, because none of that actually makes any sense without the sand, right? So like if you're really trying to have a real understanding as to what this thing's going to look like, it's the animation plus it's the sand. So you're doing all the anim work that you're doing, plus you're doing all this effects work, and particle work, just to get a base understanding of how this thing's going to work. So there's so much effort that goes into being able to do a previs of this thing, and so it's way harder than a traditional thing where you're just looking at the animation of a creature. It's an animation of a creature plus its environment. It's tantamount to putting something, the way they would do an Avatar, a way of water. Putting something in liquid or sand, they're ultimately kind of similar in some ways. So
started to look at it and being more of this, has a bit of grace, has a bit of elegance going through it, and has a bit of power going up and through, and it became this kind of almost sand whale effect when it was in the ground, and had a good logic to it, because at that scale, there's The sand.
And this is what I'm talking about. Like, you know, just to get an understanding of what this worm kind of looks like, you have to have all this, you know, the sand that's piling up on the front to kind of see what that effect is going to really look like. Now, one of the things that they were also doing when they were creating this movie, they were shooting it for, you know, your traditional. I think they shot in 239. So your traditional movie theater screen, right? But they were also shooting and filing shots in IMAX, which is a completely different format. It's much more square to get you that big, you know, round dome. And so they're not the same shots at all. So they were doing versions for traditional cinema, and they were doing way higher resolution versions. I think they talk about at some point in here that some of their finals were like 7K. There was like 30 shots that they had to do, which is ridiculously large, just to make it work, because they were different shots altogether. So
It would move a little bit like water because it's moving so much, and it has a kind of an epic master that we as an audience connect with, like a blue.
anyway, I think that was really cool. See, I got a couple more.
But like he was very adamant that, like, you know, he wanted the animation of the worm to be quite subtle, you know, in that you know, like this was a prehistoric beast which is a, you know, like which has roamed the desert for like thousands of years, and there was a particular scene where the worm meets Paul for the first time, and you know, like our like first versions of that animation kind of made it feel as if they were both inquisitive about each other, and like Denis being Denis, like he basically summed it up as no, this isn't what I want. I want it to feel as if it is a lobster meeting a goat for the first time, you know.
That's a hilarious metaphor for it. A lobster meeting a goat. They just do not exist anywhere in the same environment whatsoever. But I think that's really cool. I want to talk about something that I learned about this. I'm going to show you here, right here. Okay, so,
And
oh, come on, the shot right here.
which has roamed the
Okay, so you can see this is kind of the final shot. You can see kind of the just the color grading they've done and stuff like that. Okay, now this really speaks to the way the film was shot and the way that it was processed ultimately. Okay, so obviously films used to be shot on film mostly, and this film in particular, I believe it was shot on an Arri Alexa, which is a digital format. And you know, if you're like me, I grew up watching movies in the 70s, 80s, 90s, that sort of thing, all shot on film. And film has its own very, very specific look. Things that are shot on digital, they really are, you know, they've got their roots. You know, Granddaddy video camera was like, you know, the VCR camcorder from the 80s, right? And it had, you know, a little bit of a little chip in it that you know, received the thing. But one of the things you always see, particularly when you're looking at a hot light source, like a light bulb, a little candle glow or something like that, there's a little bit of a bluish tint around the edges of the light. And I don't care how old the camera is, even in the most modern cameras, you still, in my view, because I look for it, it's still there. And it's still, so video, and that's what it is. It's really, really high resolution video. It has its own look, and versus film. Now, film is much more organic. It processes light a little bit differently, and has a real specific grain structure to it. And by that I mean, you know, as you're shooting it through the celluloid, each frame it's a strip of an organic material. So it's got, you know, every single frame, it's a little bit different because the grain, little bits of light and dark that you see on the film, it's endemic to the medium that's there. And so that grain structure doesn't exist when you're looking at stuff in digital. I mean, it's completely different, and it's kind of missing. I say all of that to point out the fact that, and this really gets to how much they cared about the way this film looked. They actually shot all this stuff on an Arri Alexa. Then they printed the entire film back to film. So they took all those frames, they scanned them, and they printed them to film. And then when they rescanned them, so it included the grain from the actual film. So it was a hybrid between digital and film. And that was the first time I'd ever heard of anybody doing that. That may not be the first one ever, but to actually do that as a process for a film this big really genuinely spoke to how much they cared about making it look like film. And for my money, that's one of the coolest things that you can do, I think, is just do that. Now, way, way, way more expensive. And honestly, probably very few people other than me and a few other filmophiles would really care about that. But you can see it. If you actually look, you can actually see that the love and care that they put on something that so few people are going to ever actually really appreciate. But that to me was a really nice thing that deserves a bit of a mention, because it's impressive. I got a couple other things here. I wanted to show you, like I said, they shot all those stuff on IMAX.
Shot, for example, is that you have the IMAX frame in the center. It's been angled back for creative purposes, but then the actual 239 version of this has an extension either side, which is then shrunk down to fit into 239. And I believe Tristan, you worked at 7K for, or like your like final renders were actually 7K for these 29 shots.
Yeah, if you listen really carefully, you can still hear the render farm screaming. Yeah, no, it was.
You can still hear the render farm screaming, because that's just, I mean, every time you res up, it's just so much more expensive in terms of pixels and math that it has to do. But again, this also kind of really strikes to the fact that they spent so much time making sure that it looked right. There was clearly no shot that was going to get out that wasn't exactly perfect. And so they had to reformat things, or they had to do multiple shots that were specific to IMAX and specific to the 239 theatrical formatting. So that's impressive, actually, just the care to detail. So I know I'm gushing and fawning over this movie, but it is what it is. It's pretty cool. Now this kind of goes back to the original Dune. There's a fight sequence in there, and that they did a lot of motion capture for it, which is ridiculously impressive.
I learned that it was fully CG. I was incredibly surprised. I felt, of course, there was some sort of crowd stuff going on in the background, but to learn that you and DNEG orchestrated a motion capture shoot for this and realized the sequence in CG. Robin, just coming to you, what was it like doing that motion capture for this sequence?
It was a challenge.
I always love when people say it was a challenge. Like what they really mean is, oh my God, it was a nightmare. But because if you start looking at what they did to pull this off, and they also did it during COVID too. So you had all the 6 foot apart nonsense, and you had and so they couldn't have a full force of people that were in the same room at the same time, and so they had to piece all this stuff together.
I think terrifying covers it. I remember you at the time.
I remember the exact meeting with Paul about it, and it's one of the hardest, but again, one of the most satisfying shots I think I've been a part of, fortunately. This is Dune. This is what we like. It's true. All of us in this call like the hard work, because that's the good stuff. So when we got this, when we got something like this, originally it was lots of individual shots, and we had this kind of sequence, and it morphed and changed into some amazing work from Roger.
I learned.
So what you can hear him saying there is basically originally it was just a lot of individual shots, but then it started to change into something
together.
a lot more complicated because it sounds like they turned it into one specific sequence.
And get a CG camera through that didn't look jarring and still look like a battle. So we kind of, it was a big long puzzle piece of how to work that back and forth with the stunt crew, who are, again, I can't say any more good words about them, of how it came together. But, you know, as Paul knows, just before we were going to do a very complex motion capture shoot, you know, COVID hit really hard and had changed the landscape of everything. So we had to take a break and we had to come back, and slightly thankful we had more time to kind of puzzle piece some ideas together, but we had to change how we operated, and we had a certain amount of stunties at a certain time. So I had to time capturing these moments in a certain way, utilizing only a certain amount of people. So it's like a big mass problem. So then we had to work out how we did that with the amount of people, the amount of time, and eventually we had to do it all.
Now check this out in the background here. Like, all of these people that are doing their thing in the background. I mean, all of that is just put together by motion capture artists that are cutting and pasting motion, applying to them to characters, and populating the background. And that is that's a huge bit of work, but ridiculously impressive as it is. Now, one of the huge scenes in this movie is this attack on Arcanine.
We were actually in big discussions about trying to build one of the Harkonnen ships which come down. The one where the airbags come out, and we were going to build a scale version of that and then blow it up. But what tends to happen with these things, one of these ships, because like basically it was going to be made with all these little tiny pieces, and then like we were going to explode it, and like you would have this beautiful explosion with all these tiles flying off. But you know what tends to have it as well, and then it's kind of a mixture between the two. And budget wise, like we just talked about doing like potentially doing some of the structures as miniatures, but again it would then need a digital.
So yeah, I often find that when you try and combine things, CG and live action stuff, it actually tends to make the effects look better. But when you're trying to do this, you hear them talk about budget. That's always a concern because it's ridiculously expensive to do that. So sometimes you do have to make compromises, even on a film this large.
For this particular sequence, now obviously we didn't get an explosion this big because this thing is almost nuclear. But what we did do for like some of the running, where like Gurney is running towards the ships, is that like we had great big fireballs on set to provide the interactive lighting. So those were timed for.
That's a huge part of making this work. Now, obviously, these explosions, you would never put, actors in this kind of harm's way, obviously. But what he is getting at, which is really cool, is just making sure that the interactive lighting works. So yeah, you can blow off a much smaller explosion and then cover it with these larger explosions, just to make sure that your actors are lit correctly and they feel like they're in the middle of that action, although they're perfectly safe. But again, this is attention to detail, and that's why it won the Academy Award.
Particular moments, which like then in post we would then add like some of the amazing CG explosions which we had developed. Now we did shoot a couple of explosions on the backlog in Budapest just for reference, and I don't believe they actually made it into the film, and they were only used for reference. But yeah, again, it's a continuing theme in Dune was trying to get the best light. But then,
all right, I got one other one here just to talk about, and these are
the effects,
much smaller effects, but it had actually a real interesting part to it is just the training shields. There is before and after frames. So basically, whenever they're moving, they're going to take the current frame that you're on, the previous frame, and the frame after the current frame, and try and like do some sort of jitter effect between them. And that works, right? And it's a great idea. I did some work on a Star Trek Borg adventure that was in Las Vegas, and some of the transporter scenes were very similar to this as an idea, right? And so what I can say from my own personal experience is it's not easy, and so particularly when there isn't a lot of movement, before your previous frame, your current frame, and your next frame are almost exactly the same. So you're not going to get a jitter effect. So you got to figure out a way to do that. And as a comper, that can be tough. And so he keeps talking. I love how he says it wasn't a punishment. When you get on a hard sequence, even it's one it's not a hero. I mean, it is, but it's not like, the explosions and all that stuff. When you're doing something of that nature, sometimes as an artist, it can feel, how did I get relegated to this? I'm figuring out, I'm just doing frames, but you still pour your effort into it and you make it the best it possibly can be. And it certainly came out well. I think that's one of the things that I really appreciate about it. Now, that's essentially all I've got to talk about today in regard to Dune. I know I probably sound like a huge fanboy, but in terms of the fact that they did such great work consistently, that is so hard to do. The work on the first one, and to retain maybe the crew and the cinematographer and all the people that are involved to come back and do another one and make sure that it feels like it's an exact connection to be the two. Really impressive work. So anyway, that's Dune 1, Dune 2 is a conversation. So anyway, thank you for watching.